Welcome to Faith Foundation's Biblical Wisdom for Today's World. Join us as we explore the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other Christian resources to strengthen your faith and navigate life's challenges. Good day, folks. Welcome to another episode of Faith Foundations, a podcast where we explore the core truths of Christianity and how they apply to our lives. Now, before we begin, I want to clarify that the views expressed by the next guest and any future guest here on Faith Foundations do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any future guests on this podcast or Faith Foundations itself. Each individual brings their own unique perspective and understanding of faith. We respect the diversity of thought within the Christian community. Our goal is to create a space for open and honest dialogue about matters of faith we encourage our listeners to approach each episode with an open mind and a willingness to learn from one another. While we may not always agree on every point, we are united in our love for Christ and our desire to grow in our relationship with Him. So, whether you're a long-time believer or just beginning to explore your faith, we invite you to join us on this journey of discovery and growth. Let's dive in together to see what God has in store for us today. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Faith Foundations. I'm your host, Pastor Barry, and today I've got a special guest, Dr. Tom, who is a independent scholar and has a Ph.D. in New Testament here. Today, we're going to be focusing on kind of an interesting topic. I know that those of you who have been following the podcast recently, we've been going through a biblical series on maturing in Christ, and so we're going to take a bit of a deviation today, and we're going to talk about something a little bit different that it can be a bit controversial, but we're going to be looking at a Greek word, proskyneō, and which is translated as worship here. And so Dr. Tom is going to, I guess he'll do a little bit of a brief introduction of himself here to let you folks know who he is. And I've got a few questions for him here, and hopefully we can kind of get to the bottom of this Greek word and how it applies to us in our daily lives as Christians. All right, Dr. Tom, Tom, take it away here.
Thanks, Barry. It's good to talk to you. I don't have too many friends in Manitoba, but now I do. I'm so glad to talk to you today. I'm 71 years old, Barry. And just to quickly, I became a Christian when I was 18, born again, that kind of thing, and was changed my life and haven't changed since. I got involved in ministry right immediately, went studying for ministry. I got a bachelor's degree in Bible and religion, a minor in Greek, went on to grad school, to seminary, did the 3-year MDiv program, got involved in full-time ministry for about 10 years, and then got out of the ministry in 1985, and I was basically in the corporate world for the next 35 years, but always continuing to study, continuing to speak in churches, and continuing with small groups. In 2016, since I'd been studying this topic we're going to talk about today for 40 years at that point, wow, and had come to some remarkable conclusions that were just mind-boggling. I wanted to take these conclusions through a Ph.D. grinder. And so I was accepted into a doctoral program at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City. I pursued a Ph.D. in New Testament, eventually did my dissertation over a 2.5-year period. And by the way, that's working full-time on the dissertation, not on the side, not on Saturdays and on weekends or that kind of thing. I was full-time, like 10, 12 hours a day for 2.5 years. And then I did get my PhD in 2022. But the important thing there was I was after the dissertation, and I was after studying this topic and throwing it up against a PhD program and see what sticks on the wall. And I'm pleased to say that the stuff sticks, and it's worth looking at, and it's dramatically different conclusions than what is commonly heard of in any church environment today.
Mm-hmm. That's actually why I wanted to have a conversation with you, is just to kind of backtrack a little bit there for even the viewers. Is I was sitting on my couch a couple weeks ago, probably about a month ago or so, just letting YouTube do its thing and go through the cycle of recommending. And one of your videos popped up, and it was I think it was video 4 in your series, your seven lectures there. And it popped up, and I let it kind of go through a little bit there. And I said, I usually have this thing where it's if I'm not interested in the first 20 minutes, I'm not gonna bother with it. I'm just gonna just cycle through. And you started talking through some things, and in the first 5-10 minutes there, I leaned up and I said, "This guy sounds like a quack." No offense, but and then I kept listening, but you had my interest. And then I said, wait a minute, there's something here. And so I paused the video and I jumped on my computer and I started back from the first one. And I sat there and I listened to every single lecture in one sitting. And I said, wow, I need to have him on my podcast. You've got something going on here, especially for us as pastors, because we, pastors that like to study the word, like myself, that like to look at the Greek and look at these things, we come across these portions of where it comes, we describe worship, right? We're talking about worship on Sunday mornings typically, or we have gatherings, or this term comes up. And when you look at it, if you look at the syntax of the words being used there, it doesn't quite fit the way we do things today. And that's kind of what started me on my journey for the last 6 years. Was a gentleman of mine came in, I had led him to the Lord and I baptized him. And he said to me, he's like, Pastor Barry, why is it that I see things happening in the Bible when I look at the church today, they don't quite line up? There are things that they're doing here that we're not doing here, or we're doing things differently than what is described in the Bible. And I said, you're right. And so I said, let me take a look at this myself and go on this. And I've been on this journey for 6 years. And then I come across you, and I'm going, okay, you've checked a box that I want to delve deeper, but I don't have a PhD. I barely have anything. Barely have credentials as it is. So I want to surround myself with folks that have done this, and that's kind of where this all kind of came from.
Yeah, well, let's pick up on that point. I really think that it doesn't take a great deal of education to get what I'm saying. You just read your Bible and you can get it. But what you have to do first is erase any preconceived notions of what the first century Christian assembly was like. That's the hard thing to do. And even scholars with PhDs have a hard time doing that. One thing I've noticed in my studies of reading so many different people who have written on this topic is that their church background, whether it's Anglican or Presbyterian or Catholic or Orthodox or Baptist, colors how they read the New Testament. And it does me too. So, but the challenge to anybody, erase the preconceived notions, jump into the New Testament, let it teach us with its own words about what was going on in those assemblies, and then we can figure out what was happening. Yeah,
no, that's good. I do want to. We're going to focus on the word here too. So, like, knowing, I know what I know about you from what your talks and the podcasts you do there. But what inspired you to investigate the meaning of the Greek word proskyneō, and its translation as worship? Because that's kind of like the primary topic, right? That's what got me intrigued. Was you had the Greek word proskyneō, and then there was worship, and the way we see worship today versus how the Old Testament sees it, the New Testament, early church New Testament sees proskyneō. Because like when I started looking into it after you had opened my eyes a little bit to the word, you're right. It just seems weird. So what inspired you to get to that?
Yeah, I was preaching in my first church in October of 1977. Now 47 years ago this month, actually this weekend.
Oh wow!
And I was preaching through 1 Corinthians, and I doing one chapter a week, and then I was in the 14th week, coming up to chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians 14. And I was tempted to skip over the chapter because it deals with speaking in tongues. And the church I was in at that time did not do that. And it was also a very controversial topic in the 70s at that time. So much so that if you even talk about it, you're going to get in trouble. But I was determined that there must be something in this chapter that's worthwhile. And so I did a deep dive into the Greek of 1 Corinthians 14. And I noticed that Paul kept using a particular Greek word to emphasize what needs to be happening in the assembly, no matter what people are doing. And that is the word oikodome, to build up one another, sometimes translated as edification, that's the purpose of the assembly. And Paul comes to this conclusion in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26. He says, "What then, brethren, when you come together?" So he's talking specifically about this topic of what you do when you come together. One person has a hymn, one person has a psalm, an interpretation, a tongue. He says, let all things be done for oikodome, edification, for building up one another. 1 Corinthians 14, 26. So I was getting this impression from Paul that he's saying that the purpose of everything we do in the assembly is to build up one another. And then it occurred to me, wait a minute. My church calls it a worship service. We call our church building a house of worship. Every Sunday we open worship with something and then we close worship with something. We have an order of worship. We have acts of worship. So many different things we talk about with regard to the assembly are saturated with worship terminology. So I then began the entire Bible, to study the word worship, which was proskyneō primarily there. It is the primary Greek word that is translated as worship. I also looked back in the Old Testament. I looked everywhere to try to figure out, well, what's this word mean if it's not that significant? Surely there must be another verse somewhere that says proskyneō is what Christians do when they get together, and proskyneō is the purpose of the Christian gathering. Not there. Nowhere.
It's not there.
Absent, which blew my mind. So that's what got me, to answer your question, that's what got me into studying that word specifically, because I thought all my life, and every other church that I've ever known of thought all their lives, that the reason we get together is to worship God.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess, going down that rabbit hole a bit more there. So we look at the word worship there. I know you've explained this in some of your videos there, but for the sake of the listeners here, what then is the proskyneō? What does that mean? What does the wording mean? Because we call it worship, but what is it actually?
Yeah, if you look in a lexicon, it will say it basically means one of two things. Number one is to prostrate yourself, to bow down, to form this act of a gesture of submission. But it's a physical thing. It refers to an act. Sometimes the word is summarized as a noun as proskinesis. It's down on your face, down on your knees. It's something you do not just to God or to gods, but also to people. That's one definition that the lexicons say that it means. The second thing that the lexicons will tell you is that it means to worship, which then begs the question, well, what did they mean by worship? Well, all that aside, when I did my dissertation, and I also did this 20 years earlier, getting more deeply into all the times that Greek word is found in the Septuagint, and it's found there 204 times, which becomes an enormous, valuable database to be able to study, to see how Jews used that term and how every Christian writer in the New Testament would have understood that term, because they would have been familiar with this act of proskinesis as it's described throughout the Old Testament. So it's found 204 times in the Greek Old Testament, and it's found 61 times in the Greek New Testament. So you got 265 times. So to cut to the quick, I began to notice that several times that the word proskyneō is used, it's used with what I call prostration indicators, like words like fall down and proskyneō. Falling down is a prostration indicator. If they're falling down before they do this, that probably indicates it's a physical gesture and they're on the ground. Another one of the prostration indicators is to be on your face. The face is mentioned often. To be on the ground is another prostration indicator. To be on your knees and proskyneōing is another. There's like 10 of these prostration indicators that point to the obvious conclusion that if you're on the ground, if you're on your face, if you're on your knees, if you have fallen down deliberately, proskynesis then likely refers to this physical gesture of bowing down. Now, the way the English translations of the Bible would make you believe is that whenever that word appears before God, they translate it as worship. But when it appears before a person, they don't translate it as worship because nobody wants to think we're worshiping humans. They translate it the way it should be translated, actually, as to prostrate yourself or to bow down, they will say. But the problem is these prostration indicators appear in both contexts massively. In other words, you are falling down and performing proskynesis to God in a temple, and you're also doing it to other people on the road or wherever you're meeting people. So prostration indicators appear in both contexts. Therefore, when the word is used in a temple context, it likely means prostrate yourself. So that's a brief answer to the question, but probably a little too long.
No worries. That's good. Yeah, because I was reading through Ezekiel yesterday, and there was the temple was he was getting the visions of the temple and seeing these things, and there was a point when you would enter through the north gate and then you would exit through the south gate. But as you entered the north gate, you would worship, or you would talk about these things, or you would go through one gate and you go through a straight line. And I saw the worship there, and I couldn't help but think, I was like, oh, stopping, going like, they're not going there to bang the smack the tambourine and sing three songs to the Lord and have a 30-minute sermon and then go out the other gate. It's like it almost seems like they enter the gate and they show some sort of physical sign of adoration towards God, which is kind of what I started to think about that, because I didn't know how to think about that before when I read that, before understanding what worship means, because it just seems so disconnected, or at least to me it seemed disconnected. Next question here would be, why?
Let me address that, Barry. You're citing Ezekiel 46, and I got to tell you, that verse was a key milestone verse for me. And in realizing something's going on here, as the Jews came into the temple in this heavenly vision that Ezekiel is describing, they stop there at that gate, and that's where they perform proskynesis, and they get up and they go straight out, because there's a long line of people. This is a feast where everybody's going to the temple, as was required by Deuteronomy 16:16. They were required, the males were required, to go to the temple, prostrate at the gate as soon as you're entering the presence of the Lord, and then you can proceed on out because you've done your duty. Deuteronomy 16:16 was another one of these verses besides Ezekiel 46 that really helped me, because there God commands that every male Jew must 3 times a year at the feasts go to the temple and present themselves to the Lord. And the second thing they must do is not come empty-handed. So when they present themselves to the Lord, there's only one way to do that: proskynesis. And you do it before the Lord. And the word before becomes another one of these prostration indicators, because you do it in front of the individual or the deity that you are performing proskynesis. You have to do it in front of them, in their presence, or else it's, what in the world are you doing out there nowhere doing this act? It doesn't make any sense. But you do it in front of them, in their presence. That's what this customary ancient gesture was, and how it was always performed throughout the Middle East at that time. People understood proskynesis as something you did before the Lord, or before a pagan god when you go to a pagan temple. And then you proceed on out because you've done your duty. Then you also offer a sacrifice. So these two things were the fundamental religious obligations of the Jew: to go to the temple, prostrate yourself.
Okay, so we're going to jump into the next point here. So we're talking about the act of bowing down, right? And what I wanted to eventually, what I want to get to is the act of prostration. It was such a like the religious prostration was a focal point in the Israeli behavior, that, and you had mentioned before before we got before I got disconnected there, which was that it was an ancient in the ancient world there, they did that a lot as well. Plus, it was more just, the physical act towards those who are a higher status of yourself. But fast forwarding to today, we have the concept of worship. But one of the biggest questions that I wanted to ask was, should we be prostrating before the Lord today? Is this still relevant today? The way that happened in the temple. Now that the temple's gone, and that Christ says that we're to worship in spirit and truth, how do we do that? Should we, as Christians, be prostrating towards the Lord physically, like the Muslims do, or do we do this in a different way?
The short answer to the question is no. I don't think this is, and there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, prostrate yourself all you want. I mean, that I don't see anything wrong there, but it would be a mistake to assume that we need to be doing this in every assembly and everybody do it at the same time. Okay, everybody down on the ground. I understand that proskynesis is a lot like what your dog is doing in the background right now. He's laying down. And I actually think the word proskynesis has a kunarion is a dog, a small dog. So proskynesis, that there's maybe some roots in this term that refer to dogs. See, sorry to get distracted there, but
No, that's good.
Many people have said, so therefore, Tom, you're saying that we need to be prostrating in our assemblies. And no, I'm not saying that at all, because nowhere does the New Testament indicate that. There is that verse in John chapter 4, where the Samaritan woman comes to Jesus and says, our fathers, our Samaritans, perform proskynesis in this temple on Mount Gerizim, but you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place where you ought to do that. And Jesus says the time is coming, and now when the true worshipers, whatever that means, will prostrate to the Father in spirit and in truth. Such God is spirit, and therefore those who worship him will worship him in spirit and truth. Well, what does that word worship mean? And here's a case where this is proskyneō, used in the context of temple activity. And studying that out throughout the Old and New Testament, wherever it is found, and there are dozens and dozens of places, it's used with these prostration indicators frequently, so that it likely means it's referring to this required, obligatory, ritual act of prostrating to the Father. And so whatever Jesus is saying there, he says it's supposed to be done in spirit and in truth. I think what his point there is twofold. Number one, I think he's predicting the destruction of the temple, along with several other places and hints that he does in the Gospel of John. Here's another one. He says God is spirit, and a God being spirit, he can't be confined by the four walls of any building. And so when people come to him, they must come to him with their spirit and in truth, in total sincerity. So that's where the parallel to his point in the Sermon on the Mount comes, because there he's saying, when he talks about fasting and praying and giving, you don't do this stuff to be seen by men, to show off, just like you don't prostrate in order to show how religious I am, but rather this stuff is to be done in secret. Like you go in your closet and that's where you pray. You don't do stuff to be able to show off to other people. And the same thing would be true with this prostration for Jews. But the real prostration now, the real devotion to God is something inner and true. It's sincere. It's meant. But I don't think there's nothing in the context of John 4 that is talking about an assembly. We tend to think it's talking about an assembly because we see this English word worship there. And the first thing that pops up in our mind when we see the word worship is, oh, they're talking about what we do in church. Well, the word's never used elsewhere in the Bible to refer to what you do in church. So why are we doing that? So So I think, anyway, the short answer to your question is no. There's no place else in the New Testament where it talks about, let's go together to this holy place, this holy building, and that's where we'll drop down on our knees and perform proskynesis to God. Well, Christianity doesn't have holy buildings. Christianity has no sacred spaces, which brings another reason why it's not done in their assemblies. The Jews did it in the temple because that's where God resided. Everybody knew it. Right. And the only way you can present yourself to God is through prostration. But in the New Testament, the buildings are gone. Temples have no meaning. There is a new temple, and we are that temple. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. God now dwells within us, and we can't prostrate to ourselves. It just doesn't make sense. And there is no holy building someplace anymore where we do holy acts like that. So that's why it just goes away. You don't see it elsewhere in the New Testament, and you actually don't see anybody prostrating themselves throughout the 2nd or 3rd century as well, if you study Christian literature after the New Testament. It's absent. There's even places in the church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd century where they make fun of pagans that are prostrating themselves with their face to the ground. One of the writers made fun of them, saying, yeah, you're looking down to the earth. That's where demons live. We Christians, we stand up. Our Father is above. We hold our head high. So prostration goes away from the Christian experience because God now is everywhere in our hearts. He's not confined to a building anymore.
Yeah, that is such a wild, it seems so interesting because it, for most of the basic Christian out there, like that's such a wild concept. Like you had said originally there, we have to kind of like wipe away that understanding that we have already, because like we understand everything as like we understand the way worship is in a modern context. Like when we see worship in the Bible, you're right, we tend to marry that with our modern understanding of worship, which often involves feelings and emotions, which is kind of an interesting concept, because we have worship services now, and so I catch myself now trying to maybe not say those things. Like I'm a big advocate of what you originally said, which was the edification and encouragement of the body. I've always seen it that way. I've always seen the role of the pastor is the teacher. I'm here to expound on the word, to teach those who are a part of the assembly the truths of the scriptures, and to encourage them, to build them up for the work of the ministry or the work that God's called them to, whatever that may be, whether it's pulling wrenches for Jesus, or whether you're a baker, you're going to, you do what you do for Jesus, and I'm going to teach you to how to become a mature believer. And so
Hey there, friends, it's Chaplain Barry here, your host on Faith Foundations. I wanted to take a quick moment here to share something with you that's been on my heart. As you know, I'm a pastor and a teacher, and my passion is to help people grow in their faith and find hope in the midst of life struggles. That's why I pour out my heart into creating content that points people to the truth of the gospel. But here's the thing, I can't do this alone. Running a website and producing a radio show takes resources, and that's where I need your help. By visiting www.nlmrebellion.co and supporting this ministry, you're not only helping me keep the lights on, you're investing in spiritual growth of countless people who tune in each week. When you visit the site, you'll find a wealth of resources to help you in your own journey of faith. From free ebooks to understanding suffering and rethinking church methodology to powerful teachings that'll help you triumph over the darkness, there's something for everyone. So if this ministry has blessed you in any way, would you consider partnering with me to keep things going strong? Your support, whether through a one-time gift or ongoing partnership, makes a real difference. Thanks again for listening, and remember, no matter what struggles you're facing, there is hope and purpose that can be found in Christ Jesus. Keep fighting the good fight. Chaplain Barry out.
one illustration that helps put our minds in the proper place. We're so accustomed now to church buildings. And usually those church buildings have these steeples, or they have the stained glass, and they have these big crosses and all this holy stuff there. And we tend to treat that building special. And that's where God is, that's where the man of God does the thing in the house of God, and all those concepts that are built into our system. But erase that. Let's get back to the first century. And where did Christians meet when they met together? They met in homes. That was the typical place. There are at least 5 times in the New Testament where Paul or the writer specifically refers to the church in somebody's home. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong or sinful, or you're going to go to hell if you meet someplace else. But let's just get that in our head. Let's understand that context. It's not a holy place. There's no sacred stuff in somebody's house. It's just folks sitting around in a living room, however those living rooms would have been organized in the first century, and relating to one another, not in this sacred setting. It's just people. It's just regular folks trying to get better.
Yeah. No, that's good. No, that's there's quite a bit of a new movement, I would say, too. More recently, at least I've been seeing it more and more recently, like out of early 90s, it was still gather at the church, at least in my like from my understanding of the way church worked. But more recently, in the last even 10 years or so, there's been this big movement to get back to a house church. And and it's funny, they're trying to create a model where they're trying to throw out the whole concept of the church gatherings and come to like this house gathering. But it's like, some of them, I don't think they get that. They don't see it. They're basically just replicating big church and little church models, where they don't quite see it as the whole purpose of it is edification. It's building up the body. It's encouragement. That's what it's there for. Whether you do it in a big setting like a big church like we have here, a big building, or down the street at my house where we gather around the kitchen table, as long as the goal is to build up the body and encourage them, right? That's at least my concept of what it should be. But it seems like it's been more of a recent kind of element where the church, people wanted to go back to the homes, like they see the Acts 2 or the Acts 4 gathering in the homes, and they're just like, oh, we need to like sell all the church buildings and go back into these houses. Right? So it seems like a weird concept as well.
Well, let me say on that Barry, my videos online have now been viewed close to 500,000 times. I mean, it's just gone nuts. And what that means is I've started to get comments and emails from all over the world, and I've got over 5,000 of them so far. And much to my detriment, I'm actually reading them all. But what I'm hearing a lot of people saying what you just said, that we need to get rid of these expensive church buildings, and we need to get back to homes the way it was supposed to be. Well, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is what's important is the small group. And I'm saying that if we want to be building up one another, the best place to do that is in a small group. You can have your large group, 10,000 if you want, 1,000 or 100 or 50. But if you want to get down to where people are growing, they've got to interact with the discussion. They've got to start speaking things themselves, coming out of them, not just sitting there passively and taking it, whatever's going on. They've got to engage with the discussion. That way they start to assimilate these scriptural and spiritual principles, and it starts to change them. But the way we're doing it, I think, does not work. You can sit in church and listen to an hour-long sermon, and as soon as you hit your car in the parking lot, you've already forgotten what they said. But if you have a chance to sit down and talk about it, whether it's in a church classroom or some other meeting, wherever it is, then we can start to grow from the process. That's when edification takes place. And that's what Paul's going on. What Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, he indicates that there's a whole bunch of people who are speaking, not just one.
Yeah.
Read through that chapter and you'll see there's a lot of different people talking in a typical assembly. And that's how edification can happen when there is this participation by frequent people.
Yeah, yeah, the dialogue. I'm a big fan of the dialogue. It's funny you mentioned that too. Is recently I'd sit down and I guess more recently my ministry efforts have been more one-on-one and building up, specific leaders and working with them. And one of them, I remember sitting down with him and we were talking about, and this is hopefully get a question to it. It's your take on Dr. Heiser, the late Dr. Heiser. But we were talking about one of the concepts in the Psalms. I think it was Psalm 82 is when it was part of Dr. Heiser's work. And we were just sitting there just chatting about these things. And we took about an hour kind of going back and forth and going through just some of the texts that I have. And we looked at a little bit of the Greek or the Hebrew there. And when he got up and left there, something he mentioned to me, he was like, it's funny, I could sit with you for an hour and I've learned more in this 1 hour conversation than I have in an entire year of going to church down the street. And he's like, why is that? And I said, maybe it's the dialogue. It's like, I like the opportunity to talk about a word or talk about a passage and just have everyone else kind of add their 2 cents to it. And at the end of the day, if someone can be encouraged by it or somebody can learn something new about the Bible, then to me, that's a success story. And that's the way I like it, because I could stand there and talk monologue for hours on end, and that's just, I guess that's fine. But I mean, I prefer if other people would engage as well. I like it if I'm preaching a message and I leave room for a response, or I ask a rhetorical question and someone has the boldness to say, well, what about this? And I say, glad you asked that, and scrap my notes and just carry on the conversation down a different pathway, and let the word of God be spoken to that person. And to me, that's really, I like that. I like when that happens in a sermon. If, like I said, someone just pipes up and they're just like, oh, hey, by the way, you mentioned this, like, let's talk about that. It's like, hey, let's address it.
And you can be sure that when somebody does pipe up and ask a question, everybody's listening then. I mean, they're really riveted to the conversation. How did Jesus train his disciples? It's through parables and conversations and asking questions and responding to incidents that happen with a lady grabs his garment or a sick person comes to him, or whatever the situation is. It's these impromptu moments, moment by moment, in asking questions and answering questions that people learn. But it's not just from standing up and firing away for 45 minutes and expecting people to assimilate all that.
Because even myself, right? Like, it's difficult to absorb everything that you spoke about in your lecture series. I had to go back a few times and kind of go through this and process it, because if I sat there for 7 hours and listened to the entirety of it, I mean, I only got maybe 1 or 2% of it at first, and it took a lot of going back and digesting and writing notes. And having a dialogue of it, because I have that. The one question was, the practicality element of it, especially that whole prostration in the church. Like, is that still relevant for today, kind of thing? That's something that I didn't quite detect out of that lecture series you had, and which is great that we can have a conversation now where I can ask that question directly.
Yeah, I get it. Some people have come back to me saying, you're right, we need to be prostrating in church. Wait a minute, hold it. And people are taking off with that idea now but that comes from this presumption that what we do when we get together is to worship God. And if worship means to prostrate, then therefore, when we come together, we need to be prostrating. Well, wait a minute. Well, the whole premise is wrong. There's no biblical basis for it. So stop that. What we are supposed to be doing when we get together is building up one another. And that principle is not just explicitly stated by Paul, it's frequently stated and found throughout the New Testament as well. Let's go with that. That works, and that also changes people. It's good for us. I don't know why people are fighting against this idea so much. I think sometimes people are offended that, we're not glorifying God, and we need to glorify God. As some people say, The going to church is all about God, because if it's all about me, it ain't about much. But the problem
Mhm.
is, God is saying, wait a minute, it is all about you. You need to be getting better than you were last week. You need to be encouraging one another. You need to be strengthening one another. Don't just sit there and sing praises to me all the time. I mean, I get it. I like those praises, but I'm doing just fine here, folks. Uh, yeah, and I could go on this whole topic, but I think this idea, what we're talking about, is actually good for us. It's good for the church. It's good for people. It's good for the future. But yet there's this resistance because we're so stuck on this idea of worship.
Yeah, yeah. So with that, I know we're getting close to our time here. So what advice then would you give pastors like myself, or song leaders, church members that want to align their gatherings, their assemblies, to be more closely to the biblical understanding of the purpose of the assembly?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. In my 7th video, which is entitled, What Do We Do Now? Kind of answers your question. I think I have a list of 9 suggestions that I offer there. And just to touch on a couple of those, one is to break big groups into small groups. Now, even the
Hmm.
large mega churches understand that they need to be getting people involved in small groups, whether it's in a home or in a restaurant, or whether it's in a community building, whether it's in a school, or whether it's at wherever it is. You got to get it into the smaller groups. We got to break down into small groups. And then we need to be encouraging participation. Get people to talk. That's how we grow. That's a critical element that I would impress upon anyone. For those people who lead singing, uh, let's remember, yeah, Paul talks about singing, but he says speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Colossians 3:16 and Ephesians 5:19. This singing, yes, singing praises to God, which we do in the assembly, is done to one another. It's to
Hmm.
encourage one another, to teach one another. But I think what's often, with this overemphasis that has happened on worship in the last 30 years, we get to thinking that what we need to be doing is closing our eyes and are having our hands raised. So we're honing in on this little cubicle we've got with God. And that's fine. But where's the one another aspect of this? How are you teaching one another? How are you speaking to one another in what you're doing? In a way, we're making the same mistake that the tongue speakers did in the 1st century. They were doing their own thing, honed in on God, saying this special words that just between them and God. But where Paul says, don't do that unless other people understand what you are saying. And the
Hmm.
same thing's true with the singing as well. We need to make sure we're speaking to one another, that it's a one another activity, that's an edifying activity from which all of us are built up and made mature in Christ.
That's great. That's great. Um, so for those of us out there that or those that listen to this podcast, do you have any resources or any sources or recommendations that they could be just like the noble Berean Jews that want to study this topic a little bit further? Because I know there's going to be a few out there that are going to probably look at this going, like what other sources can we go to? Like, not everyone has access to Logos Bible software, and there are some free softwares out there. I know, like stepbible.org, that you can pull up these Greek words, but a lot of us aren't trained in Greek. But do you have any resources or recommendations there that people can go to that would, that may find interest in this, and they want to deep diver, they want to dive deeper? Sorry,
Deep diver. Yeah, I like that better.
a deep diver.
Let's do a deep diver here. Let's all be deep divers and dive deeply into first thing to look at, I think, really honestly, is the New Testament. One great resource that I have is BibleGateway.com. That's one of those online Bible websites where you can enter any passage, any book, any topic, and then it'll kick out a bunch of verses. First off, study 1 Corinthians 14
Hmm.
and look at that without the idea that the purpose of them getting together is to worship God, think in terms of what Paul is saying the purpose is. Look up the phrase one another in Bible Gateway. Let it kick out for you all the times one anothering is mentioned. And you're going to see that there's a lot of this horizontal edifying activity just expected of Christians, not only when they're in the assembly, but outside. Comfort one another. Pray for one another. Be patient with one another. Build up one another. Speak to one another. It goes on and on and on, and it's quite powerful to catch all the one anothering that's supposed to take place that frankly is not taking place with typical church as it is done today. And so those are a couple of resources. I mean, I'm talking, use your Bible.
Yeah.
But, you know, my 7 videos honestly are helpful. I do point people to that. Just go to YouTube and look for Tom Wadsworth and you'll find them there. They're getting lots of views. I can only assume that something's going on around the planet that that are making people very tired of what church is right now and looking for a better way. And I think this is just purely biblical stuff. So that's another resource I would say. Some writers. There are some guys who have written books about the house church. Now, I'm not in a house church, but house churches have caught on to this. It's much easier for people meeting in a home, in a small group, to latch onto these principles quickly. That makes that an advisable thing. So look, a couple of books on the house church that are available. Robert Banks, who is a New Testament scholar with a Ph.D. from Cambridge, who has written on this for 40 years or more. He's in Australia. He's getting up in his 80s now, but he's written some books that are very good. There's another book I just ran across a month ago called Houses That Change the World by a guy named Wolfgang Simson, Simson. That book blew me away. I was unaware of it when I was doing my dissertation, but that guy had done a lot of work to put together that particular book. So those are some of the resources that I hope might help some people.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll definitely check those ones out as well because I've got need some new books to read. It's getting into winter, so. And no, speaking of books, one of the questions I wanted to ask here was, you know, I did look up. After seeing seeing your series there, one of the first things I wanted to do is go back to look for your book, and I think the only thing I found was your dissertation. But do you plan on writing a book or a book series on your lectures?
Yes, I do. That's been the goal all along. Matter of fact, I wanted to do the book 25 years ago, but I realized I need to get some credentials or people aren't going to listen to this wacky stuff. It sounds wacky. I get it. So that's why I went through that Ph.D. program. And so now but now I got to get the attention of a major publisher. I don't want to self-publish. This thing deserves, I think, wider distribution. And so I'm looking to get the attention of a major publisher and then work with them to develop a book that has all this stuff in it, but on a readable layman's level so that everybody can understand it. But for now, there is no book available, but I hope that will change here in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a prayer point for sure. That will be, because I'd love to see this in writing as well. Like I said, I've taken a large amount of notes from your from the 7 lectures that you have gone through. Plus, I've been following you on different podcasts there and listening to kind of just seeing, you know, where this is all going and trying to formulate everything together as it is. And so that's great. I would love to see a book when it comes out. I'll be definitely checking that out. I'll be checking your website periodically to see when it comes available. And I have a couple of some final questions here that they're a little bit more fun, just because they're, you know, we have a little bit of time left. Your opinion on the work of the late Dr. Michael Heiser. He recently came up in a few circles there that I noticed that a few people were taking some shots at him, calling him a heretic in some circles, and so I was curious to see where you stand on his work.
I really like his work. I have not examined it critically. but it seems to make a lot of sense. It seems to be thoroughly biblical. And this is another case of somebody who's writing something that sounds wacky. It sounds so counter to everything we've always come to learn and believe about, like the divine counsel, as he talks about it. And yet his stuff is thoroughly biblical, deeply researched. He's a Hebrew Old Testament scholar. This guy knows what he's talking about. And I've watched a lot of his videos. I'm blown away by this guy. And it's a shame that he's no longer with us. But boy, a large body of his work remains that we can study. Honestly, I feel a lot in common with Dr. Heiser in that the stuff that I'm saying also sounds wacky. I get it. It sounds radically different. It almost sounds heretical. And I've been called, yes, a heretic and a false teacher. And I've been accused of blasphemy. So I've got the triple crown of excellence in ministry going for me there.
Yeah, you got the Medal of Honor.
Yeah, right there. But so I understand what he had to go through to get that stuff out. But truth is truth, folks. Bible is Bible, folks. Let's follow where the Bible leads, and let's not worry about what people are going to say about it. That's my reaction to Michael Heiser.
That's great. No, yeah, I respect Dr. Heiser's work as well. I came across him. I can't remember exactly where it was. I think it was a YouTube short came up, and I was like, "What is this guy talking about?" You know. So I started diving deep, and now I've read through almost every single one of his books. I think I own his entire library of books, including some of the older ones. And I appreciate the work that he had. And it's too bad I came to know who he was after he died, and which kind of sucks because I would have loved to have him on the podcast to talk about some weird stuff, because that's kind of fun. Last question for you, and it's more related to non-canonical books or deuterocanonical books. What value do you have? Do these non-canonical books like the Didactic and the Shepherd of Hermas? What level of value does that have for a local church, or even the Book of First Enoch?
I find them all fascinating myself. I love to read those documents, like First Enoch. Let's take that for example. First Enoch is actually quoted in the New Testament in Jude. Quotes Enoch. So and in the first century, it must have had the status of something close to scripture for some folks. But it is tough to understand because it's all this apocalyptic literature. It's a lot like reading the book of Revelation, and it's tough for modern folks to figure that out. It's tough for modern folks to figure out the book of Revelation, for that matter. But then if you get into the New Testament or the Christian literature, like the Didache or Shepherd of Hermas, or Clement and Ignatius and Justin Martyr, and on and on and on it goes. I find this stuff fascinating, and none of it is regarded as authoritative by virtually any church that I'm familiar with, but it becomes very informative in tracing the development and evolution of ideas in the church, how things were in the first century and how they evolved in the second, in the third, and the fourth. And that's why we have gotten, church tradition has gotten into very different avenues that are not productive. That's why the Reformation came around in 1517, 500 some years ago. And dramatic changes were needed because the church does evolve. And so reading these documents becomes very helpful in seeing how things started to go wrong. And you can plot that. And I did that in video number 6, which is how worship services eventually got developed. And by the 4th century is when you see this language and this full-blown idea existing in the church. But you can trace how it happens, and that's what I do in video number 6. So these documents are fascinating. They're fun reading if you can understand them, because it's another culture, it's another time, it's another person, another set of audience. I'd rather recommend people read the New Testament, of course. But if you have a deeper interest, this is fascinating stuff.
That's good. That's good. I found the same thing too. Before I got to video 6 there, I had been taking a look at some of the earlier, Ignatius and Polycarp, and reading the early church fathers, just for fun, because that's, I have nothing better to do some days.
Yeah.
And reading through Shepherd of Hermas, and in the book that I wrote, I quoted from the first Enoch as well, to kind of fill that gap in Genesis there. And I found it just, it's interesting. There's interesting concepts there, and there really was a different culture, a different time, and the church acted a lot differently then than it does now. And going back to when I had met with the fella in the coffee shop that said, why does the Bible say one thing and yet we see a different concept in the church today? That kind of started that pathway, and you can see that clearly in the ancient literatures that's available. And you're right, as you go further through, you start to see more pomp and circumstance, and you see churches morphing into something completely different than what they are, what they were or how they were previously. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So yeah. Well, Tom, it's been a great time with you. I appreciate this. I want to respect your time as well, because I know you have other obligations to go to, and I've taken enough of your time here. Is there, I guess, for the listeners there, is there a location there we can find more content there from you other than just YouTube?
I do have a website, tomwadsworth.com, and I'm slowly starting to fill more stuff into that. It's right now YouTube has become the real reservoir for most of my stuff, but the website's going to be more filled out with documents as well that people can read. So tomwadsworth.com is another place.
Awesome. That sounds fantastic. Well, Tom, it's, again, like I said, it's been a pleasure. And hopefully we can have you on the podcast again in the near future. And hopefully I'll have some different questions for you. Maybe I'll have some weird questions for you to help answer.
Well, Barry, it's been a pleasure to be with you and your dog over there, who's just aroused from sleep. So maybe that's a signal that it's time for us to go. Maybe he wants to go for a walk. Go for a walk.
Yeah.
Is that game going?
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you heard me say that.
He's starting to walk around now.
He's wagging his tail. Well, Barry, God bless your ministry, my friend, and thanks for inviting me on your show, and hope we can meet again.
Hey friends, Chaplain Barry here. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Faith Foundations on Conviction Radio. Before we wrap up today's show, I wanted to encourage you to like and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Your support means the world to me and helps me continue to share the life-changing message of God's love and grace. If you've been blessed by this ministry and feel led to partner with us financially, I invite you to visit my website, nlmrebellion.co. There, you'll find more information about how you can support our efforts and bring hope and healing to those in need. While you're on the website, be sure to check out my latest book, Conquering Shadows: Practical Tools for Spiritual Warfare. In this book, I dive deep into the rebellions found in Genesis, offering practical guidance and biblical wisdom for navigating spiritual warfare. Whether you're a new believer or a seasoned saint, I believe this book will encourage and equip you to walk in greater intimacy with Jesus. As always, thank you for being part of the Faith Foundations family. It's an honor to serve you and walk alongside you in this incredible adventure of faith. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you, and may His face shine on you always. This is Chaplain Barry, signing off.